Welcome back to Houdini Isn't Scary, Part 5, Rendering. So in this part, we're continuing from where we left off last. Last, we set up our scene, and we wanted to render it out, but we hadn't exactly reached the last step, which was setting up things like motion blur, setting up depth of field, and making sure that everything is right for rendering. So let's not waste any more time, because after this part, we're getting into our first real project. Let's get straight into it. In Houdini, from where we left off last, we have our donut, our icing, our sprinkles, our background, our lights, our camera, and we're ready to render. Or are we? There's a few things that I would like to change before we render. One of those things is our lack of motion blur. Now, our sprinkles are falling, but they aren't blurred. And if you've noticed, when recording something or taking a picture, anything that's fast moving tends to be blurred. And there's a lot of technicalities to that, such as your shutter speed and ISO and lighting and all of that, but we don't really need to worry about that. We mainly want to focus on generating blur on all of our sprinkles as they're falling. So let's go into our sprinkles node. And if we take a look at our node information, you'll see that we have a bunch of these attributes that we originally visited. And one of them, right at the end, is this lowercase v. And what that is point velocity. And we can take a look at what point velocity looks like if we say display point trails, and then just take a look at this. As you can see, these are the trails, and you'll notice that they are in the direction which our sprinkles are falling. And this is actually generated by our DOP network. Now, all dynamics networks actually generate velocity when things are run. And so coming out of a DOP network, you do have velocity. And another way to do it, as long as your geometry is not changing, so if we go to before we copy to points, we can use a trail node, plug it in over here, and as you can see, it has this result type. If you change that to compute velocity, it'll compute velocity if you don't already have it. So that's very useful, and we can put that in just to be safe. So we do have velocity, but now how do we blur our geometry based on that? So on your sprinkles node, you have to go over to sampling under the render tab and go over here where it says geometry velocity blur and change it to velocity blur. All this does is it tells our renderer that when we're rendering, look for velocity on this and add some blur. Very straightforward. We're just saying, notice this, right? This has velocity and it should be blurred. So great, we have that. And if you go to render view, switch to object camera and say render, you would expect to see motion blur, right? But you'll notice something. If you take a look, they look exactly the way they did before. And it's a bit tough to tell in the preview render, but as it clears up, you'll notice it more and more that these don't have any motion blur. And the reason is there is another place that we need to enable it, and that is on the render output node. And that is what a ROP is. As you can see over here, we have /out mantra IPR. And if you remember from the last tutorial, I said don't worry about ROPs, we're getting to it now. ROPs are render operators. And to see our render operators, we can switch from our object network. So click on your networks, and then click on out. And over here, you'll see this mantra_IPR. And this is an output node for mantra. And mantra is Houdini's render engine. Now, we're not going to go into what render engines are, but basically they deal with rendering. And different software packages have different renderers. For example, you have Mantra, you have Cycles, that's the renderer for Blender. You also have Eevee in Blender, you have Arnold for Maya, and then you have other third-party softwares like V-Ray, and each one renders differently. So we're working with Mantra, that's why we have a Mantra render output node. And on here, we have some parameters. So images is generally what you're outputting. If you go over to rendering, these are the settings, and we'll go through all of this briefly. Objects are what you're rendering from your scene. This little asterisk over here is just saying render everything. Scripts you don't need to worry about, driver you don't need to worry about. It's really just these first three tabs, and objects you might not even touch right now. That's for when you're getting a bit more advanced. But rendering and images, right? 2 tabs, don't fret. We also have these at the top, render to disk, render to mplay. Mplay is the preview render node. So if you would like to see how your render looks before you just send it to disk, you can view it in mplay. Now, let's go down to our rendering tab And over here, you'll see that under rendering engine, we have enable depth of field and allow motion blur. Over here, we're just going to tick allow motion blur. And if you take a look right now, you'll see what looks like trails. If you're not noticing the difference, you can go over to your render view and click on snap. That'll take a snapshot. You can disable motion blur, little render, and then over here at the bottom on the slider, you can go back and forth between the snapped render and the active render. So as you can see, we have these blurred trails on the motion blur render. So let's switch that back on. We've now got motion blur. Awesome. So another thing that we can add is called depth of field. And so we're going to go over here and enable depth of field. Depth of field is what gives objects a sense of scale in a scene a lot of the time. How it works is you have a point that is focused on, and everything closer than that focus point and everything further than that focus point is blurred out. And you especially notice this in macro photography, as it's known, because depth of field is very much related to scale. So that's where scale in Houdini comes in. It's one of the reasons that it's important. But let's just stop this render for now, go back to scene view, and we can also leave our out network by clicking on networks and going to OBJ. Right, back here. If we take a look in our viewport at our Cartesian plane, you'll notice something. You'll see that there are these numbers. We have 2, 3, and you can see how it goes up. So this donut is about 2 by 2 by 2, right? So what does that mean? Well, that actually means that this donut is massive. It's a 2-meter donut. In Houdini, we use Houdini units, but that's synonymous with meters. So 1 Houdini unit is 1 meter. So our donut is about 2 meters by 2 meters. Right, it's massive. And that means that our depth of field won't work accurately. So what we need to do is we need to drop down a null in our object network. And what we can do with this null is rename it to scalar. And now I'm going to show you a new concept called parenting. So what you do is you take your output of your scalar and you plug it in to each of these nodes, right? Each of your objects, you plug the scalar in. And so now these are children of the parent node. And if you make changes to the parent node's transformation, all of the other nodes also get that transformation. So what we can do is we can scale this down. So we want to scale this down to about 0.25. And now it might be difficult to focus. So click on your donut, and in the scene, while holding space or while having your camera enabled, press G, and we'll focus on the newly sized donut. And if we take a look now, there's 1 meter. And our donut's still too big, actually, 0.1, and that looks about right. So now we have our donut and our sprinkles. But we have an issue, our camera's too far out. So we can lock our camera again, click on donut in our object network, and then press G to focus on our donut. And now we can set up our camera again. We'll just set it up like this, and once we're happy with that, we can go ahead and unlock the lock to view and move around again. So now we should have depth of field, but there's one more thing we need to set up, and that's on our actual camera. If you click on the camera, once again, you can center on it with G, and then you go to your transform handles. You'll notice that there's this one that shoots off into the distance. Right down here, there's this extra transform handle. And the end of this is actually your focal point. So if you go onto your camera settings, you can bring down your focus distance on here. So you bring it all the way back until your focus distance is just about on the donut. Right, so 0.75 seems to work for me. And now, if we go to render, let's take another snap so that we can remember what this old one looked like. We can say render. Now, of course, we'll need to make some more changes. We'll need to change where our area light is, and we need to bring some more light onto our background. But if you zoom in, you'll notice that this edge at the back is sort of fuzzy. And that's good because that means that our depth of field is working. Now, you can increase your depth of field's strength by decreasing f-stop. Now, f-stop, generally you won't go much lower than about 3, so 3.2 is a decent amount, and I find that works for most things at about this scale. And now let's just sort out our lights again. So we can go back to scene view, go to camera, look through light, area light. Set your lock, switch to view, click on your donut, click on your scene view, press G, right? And then we'll just bring it back behind our donut. We'll also say look through light, spotlight 1. This time we'll click on our background, press G, and it'll focus here. We can just position it again. Great, so let's take a look at that, and it'll probably be blown out, but we'll make some adjustments. So yeah, way too bright. So click on your area light and drop its exposure to about 2. And then drop your spotlight's exposure to about 4. And then we can just make some more adjustments to these. Obviously, once again, most of this is trial and error. I can't really give you concrete settings for this. Look through light, area light, and adjust its position. And if you find that your area light is casting too much light on your backdrop, what you can do is you can go onto your area light over here, and under the area light options, you can click on single-sided. So it'll only cast light this way. That way you can basically isolate your 2 light sources. We can also drop the exposure even more, and this can be a negative number as well, and it'll still add brightness. So -2, just about there. And then our spotlight. Now, the only other thing that I'd really like to maybe do with this is to make it a bit more dynamic, so we can add some rotation to our camera. Let's rotate along the Z-axis, go to scene view, camera, and just rotate it down on the Z-axis and move it up a bit. And now it's a lot more dynamic. Go back to render view, and then one last change to our spotlight. So I think that looks pretty good. And now the only thing left to do is to actually render this out. So to render this out, we can stop our render in this preview mode and go to our out network. And you can either go to our out network from here or even up here. Now, under our images tab, you'll see this weird looking expression for output picture. It says $hip/render/hip name.$os. I thought you said Houdini isn't scary. And this is what is known as an H script expression. And it's not to make your life more difficult, but rather to make your life a whole lot easier. $hip just means where this file is actually saved. So if you take a look at the top for me, it's Houdini projects, tutorials, Houdini isn't scary. And so it's saved in this file, tutorials, under Houdini isn't scary part 4, right? So it will create a new folder called render with the name of this file. And then this just defines which frame you're currently on. And so if you're rendering a video, it would render out every single frame. It would render out a sequence of frames. So we don't even have to use this. You can very easily just use the open floating file chooser. Go to a file on your computer. I'll go to Houdini renders. You can make a new file and you can call it donut renders. Now we have this donut renders. And in here, it's asking for a file name. And so we're going to call it donut render. And so now we need to add some information to this, because if we say donut render, it doesn't know what to render, right? We're saying just donut render. But which frame is that? So we need to say $F. And so that tells it that we want to name it donut render dot the frame number. And then we need to just give it a file type. So we can give it .exr, and that's if you're working with layered images, or just for the sake of this tutorial, .jpeg. Simple. Accept, and we're ready to render. But I just want to mention that this $F, if it seems very foreign to you, is from something called HScript. Now, HScript is used for coding in Houdini. but it is going obsolete, and I wouldn't be completely surprised if it gets phased out of Houdini. Because what has replaced HScript more or less is what's known as Vex. Now, Vex is a coding language, and we'll get to that a bit later, but I just want you to know that in Houdini, there is a bit of coding that you can do, and you don't have to know how to do it, but it really does broaden what you can do. So now that we have that, we can either render to disk or render to mplay. If we render to disk, it will render it here. And if we render to mplay, it will render a preview. So I'm going to show you render to mplay first. If you click on render to mplay, you'll notice it brings up a separate window, and it begins rendering in here. And this render is different from our preview render, because it's rendering as it would a final image. It's not doing everything at once, but it's rather doing it block by block. So as we can see, we have our motion blur, we have our depth of field, our donut blurs towards the back, and it's nicely in focus at the front. And if we give that a moment, it'll render out. And as you can see, it took about 2 minutes to render this, and this is what we end up with. We end up with our donut. And you also have the option of saving from here, but I wouldn't really recommend it. You can say save frame as, bring up this at the back, and then just find a place to save it as you would. But really, the best way to do it is to render to disk. Just keep in mind that if you close this, you lose this, because this is just a preview render after all. So we can just say close. And now we can rather render to disk, and we know that it should take about 2 minutes. Now, when you click render to disk, unless you're rendering a sequence, there's no indicator showing how far that render is. So you can go up to the top left, under render, click on scheduler, and you can see all of your different renders. And this one over here, 40 seconds has elapsed. So that should take about 2 minutes. We can close this and find that file in our renders folder. So in here, I have my Houdini renders, donut renders. And here you can see that donut render 135.jpg is over here. And there's this mantra checkpoint because this is incomplete. So it's still rendering. And when it's done, that checkpoint will disappear. And then once it's done, you'll see it over here. Double click on it. There we go. It's actually saved as a file. It is now called donutrender.135 because that's the frame we were on. .jpg, right? So it's saved frame number 135 as an image. And you can also save this as a sequence. If you say render frame range, you can render from whichever range you want. And so by default, it actually just takes your timeline. So you can actually change the timeline down here to only be, 120 frames, and it'll change it over here because it's also using an expression. So I'm just going to change this back to 240. And if you click on the word over here, you can see what that expression is. It just says $f start to $f end, right? So from where the frames start to where the frames end. But you can replace those with just 1 to 80 or 1 to 120, whatever you want that to be. And then if you say render to disk, it'll render each one of those back to back, and you'll see this pop up. And this just lets you know how far along it is, and you can pause and interrupt. Interrupt is just canceling the render. Pausing, you can come back to it at a later stage. So I'm not going to render this right now, but that is how you would. So from here, I would suggest that you play around with a lot of these things. So if you go over to your object level, to your camera, and go to view, you can change its resolution, you can change focal length, aperture, all of these things. And if you're familiar with photography, this will be quite a pleasure to see because it's all right here. And the other thing that you can do is you can go crazy with this. You can go over to your material palette. So let's do something wild. Let's make a glass donut, grab glass, drag it over, put it on our donut, make a black background, and do something crazy like some gold sprinkles. And you have a nice little setup to practice everything on. You can change materials and HDRs and lighting, and your camera, feel free to do the other stuff that we've learned. So perhaps you want to add some animation to your camera, so you wanted to start in a different place at frame 1. So maybe we switch on this lock, move it over to the side, and then we keyframe it by holding Alt and clicking over there. And then as we go along, maybe we bring it over to this side, Alt, click on those again. So please feel free to go crazy with this. And I'd love to see what you do. Drop me a link, I'd be glad to check it out. Maybe you want to tag us on Instagram or something, and I'll see it there. And so go ahead. This is your playground now. and we'll be back with a proper project next time. So this was really to get you into Houdini and give you a taste of what's possible and give you a taste of what you can really expect from Houdini. And we've gone over everything you need to know really. This is the basics and we're done with the basics now. Now we can start to really add onto your knowledge and make some great effect. So I'll see you next time in part 6. We're going to be starting something really cool. Thanks for watching. Please consider liking, subscribing, and checking out our Patreon. Leaving a comment as well, letting us know what we can do better or what you'd like to see. So, see you next time. Bye.